use. These Polaroids, all I got that's left of you. Graduated work, but they said that you died at 22. Did you ever learn what was made for you? Cause I was lost and crazy, I was losing touch, I lost you too. Around the time I started breathing through new lungs, I got perspective, changed up all the things I do. They say I changed, but deep down we're still the same. No wonder if I can't make a change, or am I just the one that gets washed away? Will things go my way? Will things go my way?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're going to look at one of the greatest of all time, the number 2 player of all time. Although I believe that it is Paul Keres, we're going to do the same thing for Paul Keres. Grandmaster Paul Keres qualified for the World Championship to play Alekhine, along with Reuben Fine at Avro in 1938. Then World War II intervened, and he wasn't able to challenge Alekhine nor square away his status with Reuben Fine, for whom one of the two would challenge world champion Alekhine. As everyone knows, Alekhine later died as world champion, but Paul Keres remained in the top 10 and 20 in the world until his death in 1975. He was always a contender, frequently a contender for the World Chess Championship, but never quite made it, along the lines of Viktor Korchnoi, who actually did play nearly 3 World Championship matches. Little did we know that the World Championship semi-final between Karpov and Viktor Korchnoi in 1974, which also went the distance, would be the challenge match to a Bobby Fischer that wouldn't show up for the title. So whoever won this semi-final became world champion. It is also said that had Viktor Korchnoi won the match, Bobby Fischer would have played, because then he understood who his opponent was. But Karpov came out of nowhere like a shooting star, and Viktor Korchnoi was a known quantity, and Bobby Fischer very much disliked unclear positions as well as unclear chess games. In this particular instance, Viktor Korchnoi, the year is 1949, one of the earliest games of Viktor Korchnoi. Basically, in this particular instance, Viktor Korchnoi shows sign of his future repertoire as he plays. I want to just set it up here. The Catalan. He starts off with an opening that is today regarded as one of the most reliable, solid openings for white. In fact, it is so reliable that the only way it could be brought down when Garry Kasparov played Viktor Korchnoi for the world title, I think it was also practically a semi-final to play Karpov. Garry Kasparov overwhelmed Viktor Korchnoi. In fact, the Soviet Union had its say in that matter as well, as they were supposed to play in California, and they refused to grant Garry Kasparov a visa. So they wanted Garry Kasparov to forfeit the semi-final or the quarterfinal. I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. My mind just got fuzzy. But basically, Kasparov would move on to challenge no one if he couldn't get to the match and forfeit the match. Basically, Korchnoi would then play Karpov again, and Karpov wouldn't have to play the rising star Garry Kasparov in 1983. Garry Kasparov and, of course, Korchnoi would have nothing to do with this, and they managed to rearrange or reorchestrate the World Championship candidates match for London in 1983, whereby the Catalan indeed was played. Garry Kasparov actually played the terrace defense as usual on his way to the World Championship. He was only stopped by Karpov in 1984 in two rather brutal losses in the end game. However, in 1982, in the Olympiad, when Garry Kasparov faced Viktor Korchnoi, Garry Kasparov answered with c5 and turned the game into a Benoni and won a rather startling and brilliant game with the black pieces in super aggressive fashion. That's one of the ways to avoid the Catalan. Another way, of course, to address the Catalan is just to accept the fact that we're going to put a pawn on d5. And after bishop to g2, I personally, for a period of time, also liked the open variation with d takes c4. The closed Catalan, which is extremely, let's just say, difficult to a certain extent, usually evolves into a line along these moves where both white and black develop their pieces accordingly, and black takes care of the development of the queenside bishop with move b6. However, as it turns out, in our particular game, we are going with the open Catalan, where we open the center. In fact, today, black usually and often does play the move knight c6, even tripling his pawn in some variations of this. However, Viktor Korchnoi takes a safe approach, playing queen a4 check and recovering his pawn. Today, Anand, Duda, even Magnus Carlsen has won a game. They often play the move a6, and after the move bishop e3, have a variety of choices they might face after the move bishop to d6, either knight h3, knight f4, or queen c2, just parking the queen on a normal square. However, instead of a6, the year is 1949, the opponent decides to jump into the d5 square instantly. And by using the d5 square, perfectly logical, after all, by using the d5 square, this sets up a rather serious central blockade. Now, this doesn't mean that the pawn on d4 can't be eliminated, as black tackles this pawn straight away with the move c5. White defends with knight f3, and after c takes d4, the popular modern move in this position is queen takes d4. However, Bruce, our vegetarian killer whale of an engine called Stockfish 17, prefers, obviously, to take with the knight or just to castle and not to mess with this pawn. However, knight takes d4 was played. Black counterattacks with bishop to b4 check, and after bishop takes d2, knight on b takes d2, as though any other knight could take on d2. Black castles, with the idea, by the way, that he's going to play e5 and free his light-squared bishop. So in this particular position, we are going to consider our first candidate move moment, as the opening has come to an end. And we are looking for candidates for white in this particular position. Candidates for white. Obviously, we have to consider what's going on in this position. But with the move with the idea that we are handling or have to choose how to handle e5, and we have our own opening development yet to complete, and of course the pressure on the d file. What might we do in this position? We'll just consider it for 45 seconds. Now remember, when you're looking at candidate moves, you're not looking for the best move at the outset. You're scooping up all of the good moves in a position. And once you've scooped up all the good moves, which shouldn't take you more than 10 or 15 seconds, obviously, it takes fellows like Magnus Carlsen less than that. microseconds to scoop up all the good moves, and then they immediately set upon calculating which of those moves addresses the opponent's idea, where are the weaknesses, and whether or not we're improving our worst placed piece. So in this particular instance, we deal with e5 in the most direct manner possible. Korchnoi chooses to play f4. However, it was possible just to ignore this particular move. We could have just castled, and after the move e5, we would choose whether to place our knight on b3 or f3. I'm going to choose knight to b3 for a moment due to the queenside action. And then black would probably avoid the exchange of queens with queen to e7. Now, had the knight gone back to f3, black might have traded on d3, isolating the d3 pawn, but then he has to deal with the attack on the e5 pawn. So after a move like queen takes d3, e takes d3, move like knight on f to d7, followed by perhaps f6, knight to c5, knight to e6, and knight to d4 could occur. Or we could reach none of that and play the move that Viktor Korchnoi played, f4. Now, black chooses the wrong knight, in my opinion, to move toward the center. It's always good to have our king side defended, but black chooses the move on knight on f to d5, and of course white is considering the possibility of playing e4 to evict this knight. However, this is going to require a3, which is perfectly reasonable here. Certainly we should also castle. However, Viktor chooses to improve his worst placed piece on d2 with knight on d2 to f3. Black, of course, wants to activate his rook on a8. White gets castled, and this is perfectly reasonable. As black does activate his last rook, we play the absolutely necessary a3 move, and after the move queen to e7, which is a bit of an accuracy, I could quiz for black's moves here, but black should obviously try to take advantage of the weak dark squares and the placement of his knight on b6 with knight to a4, and this position would more than likely just simply be equal. Equal chances for both sides. Not a draw, by the way. You shouldn't confuse an equal position with that of a draw. All equal really means is that both sides have equal chances to both play amazing or far from amazing moves. The opponent, however, connects his rooks in beginner-like fashion with queen to e7, and it's at this moment that we have to decide how we are going to continue. So once again, thank you, Eric Blair. Great to see you, sir. Good morning. Castles are e3. e3 is a little conservative, but we are going to look for candidates again. Now remember, the reason I'm shortening it to 45 seconds is because I don't want anyone to overthink this. Certainly castles was the best move, more than likely, in that previous position. So you were right on board point. So here, as this is a subscribers only chat, I no longer have TTS working for subscribers at the moment. There seems to be a problem with the speech chat service. The website is either down or it's disconnected or it doesn't work with Streamlabs. In any event, we are trying to find all the good moves in the position. In this case, we could be centralizing either rook. We could be threatening mate on h7. We could be outposting a knight on e5, I believe is what Eric is saying. Knight to e5. Or we could be overwhelming the center in a manner in which it is best. After all, we've been preparing this move, e4, and the knight is driven out of the center. The knight, unfortunately, has to return to either c7 or f6. c7 is better than f6. And for that reason, we are going to go for our candidate moves once again. Now, this is good to throw 3 darts at the position. When you're playing a darts game, you're allowed to have 3 chances, so you should do at least 3 candidate moves when you're throwing your best moves at a position. Reach and stretch yourselves within the 45 seconds to throw those candidate moves out there as quickly as you can. And in this particular position, we have the same candidate moves as last time. We could be centralizing our rooks. We could be expanding on the queen side. We could be outposting a knight. We could be grabbing space on the queen side. So in this particular position, as it turns out, now remember, I know that there are many video streamers that say pause the video, but in general, it's like a blind lead in the blind. When you haven't seen a pattern, or you may not have a pattern to recognize, it is often best to just let yourself see what the wheel looks like. And in your games, hopefully, your games, you will find the best move. Now, the best move here was not played by Viktor Korchnoi. Viktor Korchnoi should have played e5 right away. Instead, he chose the expansion on the queen side plan, which by any means is not necessarily so bad, but black does have the opportunity to latch onto those weakened white squares with moves like bishop to a4, or centralizing the rook as he does in the game with rook on f to d8. And only now does Viktor grab the space just a little bit, a tempo too late to seize the advantage that he could have had with the immediate e5. And once again, I would like to say it is time to go for, f5 is also an opportunity, I think, but we have to be careful that we haven't activated all of our pieces in the position. We don't want our opponent to actually play e5 either and dislodge our knight. So f5 without fixing first the e6 pawn could be awkward. So in this particular position, and you can of course find all of these instructional videos perhaps at a slightly slower pace. Unfortunately, I'm going to pick up the pace as much as I can to make these shorter than ever, because not everybody has all the time in the world. On the YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube for notifications for videos there. Bishop h3 should be considered. We are trying to improve our worst place piece, and right now the 2 knights are a little redundant. When you have 2 knights guarding each other like this, they're often considered redundant knights. They're doing the same exact job. And of course, black has the same problem, which is why much earlier, the idea of knight to a4 should have been considered. In this particular case, Korchnoi improves his worst placed piece at the moment, not knowing where the rook on a1 is going, with knight to g5 tickling the h7 pawn in a manner in which it's going to help him decide the game. After all, when black answers with the only logical move g6, we're able to re-centralize our knight, and although our opponent also fixes his problem, and the position, of course, is still relatively equal chances for both sides. I'm going to stress that again. Now, the knight on c4 is controlling the d6 square. It's preventing any funny business on the d6 square. So therefore, it is very logical to try to remove that knight in some fashion or another, or carry on in another fashion. So we are going to once again go for our candidate moves on what could be done. Now, Korchnoi actually chooses a rather tragic move in this position. I'm going to give it the dubious in just a moment. But at the same time, Korchnoi's move could be played by any one of us in this position. Remember, we are trying to keep in mind, where are the weaknesses? What is the opponent's best placed piece? What is our worst placed piece? And Korchnoi goes by that mantra in this particular position. Rather than improving his worst placed piece, I believe that he sets about attempting to dislodge his opponent's best placed piece. Now, black does have a very serious threat of playing at knight, either knight, to the e3 square in this moment. So rook on a to e1 is perhaps the most logical move in the position. Another move, which I have to give an exclamation mark to as well, is a4, h4, just going for it. And black is going to play bishop to a4 and dislodge any knight on the, and try to seize upon the c2 square if he can with his knight going to e3. However, Korchnoi goes for the rather awkward knight to c5. And the knight to c5 move runs into some serious problems as his opponent does not look for all of the dynamics in the position. Now, there's a really interesting story that around this time, when Petrosian was young, Petrosian missed an exchange sacrifice and was derided so badly by members of his club for not seeing an obvious exchange sacrifice that he went on to do everything in his power to master the exchange sacrifice, commonly exchange sacrificing his way to becoming one of the best players in the world and the purveyor of, and the most reputable purveyor of, exchange sacrifices. Black, of course, should have played rook takes c5, and after b takes c5, queen takes c5. You can see how black's pieces are thoroughly dominating the board. The white rooks are still resting on their laurels. But instead, black played the move b6, and this allowed Korchnoi to dive in, bothering the rook on d8, sending it packing, because obviously there are problems with putting the rook on e8. And after rook on f to c1, a move that I did plan on quizzing on air. Yeah, knight to d2, removing the defender. I might have still chosen rook on f to c1 if I were to attack the knight directly. But in any event, unless that was for the previous one, to go to e4 from knight to g4. But we're going to gain time with the move knight to g5. By gaining time, we also weaken the opponent's dark squares around the king. You can actually see that f6, h6, really, really weak. And that is a little bit of plot bridging to what actually happens in the game. So black reinforces his knight, and Korchnoi once again has an opportunity in this position for a small advantage and then to increase it to a larger advantage in this very position. Now, it's not a new intuitive move, if you must know the truth, because we will cover the values of the pieces with this move once again. So remember, you're scooping up all of the good moves in the position, and certainly this should be one of your candidate moves. If you don't look at a lot of candidate moves, by the way, something could escape you. You will never become Mikhail Tal by not looking at a lot of candidate moves, even the most improbable ones. It helps to look at improbable candidate moves as much as the most probable candidate moves. Conformity does not help you stand out. Very happy to have you here. So in this particular moment and instance, rook takes c4. A little extreme, obviously. Knight to d6 is a little too early. f5, keep that move in mind. That's all right. Forget I said rook takes c4. Well, no, I won't, because obviously it is a shot. Now, moves like bishop to e4 and bishop to f3, just simply improving our bishop against any possible incursion by a knight to e3, are certainly worth checking out. But the best move in this position, disturbing the black pawn structure, was apparently bishop takes e5, so that after e takes d5, we can actually try to continue our assault on the squares in the center, we're going to have to relocate a rook perhaps, but we might get in the moves f5 and e6 in this position. Note that black's bishop is rather terrible, and it is tied down to the defense of the b5 pawn. So the pawn on d5 is an eyesore, and he could have had this instead. However, he chose equality again with the move knight to c5. And after the move knight to c5, black should perhaps place his bishop on the long diagonal and prevent the plan that we were just discussing. Because after the move, rook on f to d8, we have it once again. Bishop takes d5 is once again the perfect move to play, and this time Viktor Korchnoi finds it. Notice that he's very young in this position. So in 1949, he's a far cry from becoming a championship challenger. However, this is the 18th Soviet Union championship being held in Lvov. And after e takes d5, I said we were going to have to support our e5 pawn in order to threaten to play the move f5, and it's now happening. And when black takes his eye off the ball with bishop to c6 this time, black had once again needed to find the move rook takes c5. And I believe I would have found that because white's knight is so powerful. So after the move rook on a to c1, I'm going to mention that a knight on the third rank, we know the disparity between the knights and the bishops, right? Bishops are supposed to be that much better than a knight. Just like the center pawns push pieces out of the center, they're more valuable in the beginning of the game than the wing pawns. Well, a knight on the third rank is worth a knight. A knight on the fourth rank is worth a bishop. A knight on the fifth rank is worth more than a bishop. And a knight that could possibly be outposted on the sixth rank, we already know from games like Lasker versus Capablanca in St. Petersburg 1914, a knight on the sixth rank can be worth almost as much, if not as bothersome as it can be to rooks, worth very close to the value of a rook. So in this particular position, black actually played the move bishop to c6, and Korchnoi goes about. Hey, Erikito, good morning. Great to see you, buddy. Our blue belt. The 1-year badge. Welcome back. We have one more time to look at our candidates for white. I am trying to do more of these. I do have to visit someone at the hospital immediately after this, so I have to boogie. So I probably won't be doing another one today. However, I will be doing these at all odd hours. So if you've not yet subscribed to the YouTube, that is the best place to get generic notifications. Of course, you can be a Twitch subscriber and get the notifications that way as a follower. But in general, these are for you to become a better player, testing yourself against your peers. The move that Korchnoi plays should indeed be among your candidate moves. In fact, there are two such moves. E6, absolutely Erikito. E6 should be considered, but G4 tells me, even though it's an outside possibility, G4 tells me that you have missed the possibility of playing Korchnoi's move, rook to E2, or possibly rook to A2 with the same idea in mind. Obviously, after the move rook to E2, A5, we're simply going to pound our opponent by reinforcing the E5 pawn, and E6, of course, was a good move. However, rook to E2 was a much better move because we need to involve all of the pieces in the attack. Many, many years ago, studying the games of Garry Kasparov on my route to reinforce what I had already become a master at that point. But I would study Garry Kasparov's games, and you thought he was going to attack with something like e6, but no, he would prepare it. And then you thought he was going to play e6 or embark upon the attack, and no, he would prepare it. And he would prepare it, and he would prepare it. He'd bring another piece in, and you thought he was going to break through, and he'd bring another piece in. You thought he was going to break through, and he'd bring another piece in and make a cohesive, coordinated whole, as Korchnoi shows here. You'll notice that the knight on c5 seems to be impervious. So black does not exchange on b4 just yet. Instead, he has a tactical idea which overlooks Korchnoi's plan, by the way. He does find perhaps the best move, bishop to e8, to try to defend. But that e8 bishop also takes away a square from the queen, if you ask me. And white begins now by crashing through with f5. And we already know that black is experiencing some tunnel vision because he removes the defender of the c5 knight. If white were to blindly just take back, then a takes b4 would keep the status quo after queen takes c5. And we would have lost 2 pawns on the queen side. Of course, we're recovering on b5 in short order, but rather than taking that knight, suggestions for white. Candidates for white. And we've already reached our 30-minute mark, so I'm not entirely pleased about this. I may edit off the waiting period at the beginning to try to bring it down to 30. And in this moment, again, we're scooping up all of the candidate moves. Certainly we will find it. And if you are looking, usually when I have students do these candidate moves, they write down several on a notepad and circle the move that they're willing to bank all of their rating points on. And then you can play a further game, a further game of study with that one, matching wits with the great Viktor Korchnoi. So f takes g, or queen f3, f6, e6, and you want knight e6 to work. Exactly. Well, f6, of course, does immediately take advantage of the weakened dark squares, and the opponent fumbles the ball completely here, as queen to f8 is forced. Absolutely forced. And then you do indeed get your lovely e6 in. So unfortunately, queen to e8, queen to f8 was a tragic error on black's part, as he plays queen to c7. And interestingly enough, Korchnoi does not play the best move in this position as we look for candidate moves again. There is a difference in the way we approach this. Of course, I could say, never mind. Bruce has found a way to work Korchnoi's mix into an efficient finish, but it is slower for a given reason, amazingly enough. And everyone, of course, should see this particular move, or moves. Of the moves that put the kibosh on black, e6, yeah, I know, you have to get a little faster. And by doing these, by the way, by doing these candidate move choices frequently and often, you can do it amongst many of my study streams on YouTube. I'm going to try to do it as relaxed as I can on YouTube, but at the same time, I want no study to be really that much longer than 30 minutes. Because we don't have enough time in the world. Korchnoi actually chooses the move queen to e3, which can slow white down because black can throw in the move queen takes e5 or queen to e7, just giving away the queen to slow down the mating tactic. But the better move, of course, was queen to d2. Needless to say, the opponent saw both moves leading to mate and an inevitable loss and chose to resign in this position. It's almost impossible to stop. For example, after queen takes e5, queen takes e5, you can see how we are derailed from reaching the h6 square. However, had he played the move queen to d2, none of that would have made any sense. After all, no matter what happens in this particular position, I'm just going to show, for example, the fact that the queen can get into the dark squares regardless of what happens. And although black can try to defer it as much as he'd like, he is going to be polished off in short order with the move queen to g7 checkmate. And of course, he could lose a heck of a lot of material. Black could throw away the queen in any number of ways to try to slow down the attack. But with the rook covering or the pawns of promoting, it really doesn't matter. Now, Korchnoi, of course, is the GOAT. I did get a chance to beat Korchnoi, and he did curse out a friend of mine when a friend of mine beat him. But that was his want. In any event, Eric Blair, great to see you. We are going to migrate one way or the other toward, it looks like the freestyle is over. And we're going to migrate to the Reykjavik Open if we can. I'm very sad to say that I wasn't able to make it to Reykjavik this year, as I did play last year. We are rating the Ginger GM, one of the most profound players. I did meet Anna Kremlin once again for the second or so time, maybe the third time. I think she might have been in Paris as well. But basically, thank you for being here. Cheers and ciao. Please check out the YouTube channel or any and all of my socials. You may get notifications there as well. Please join the Discord. That's also a place to get immediate notifications of streams. If you are only getting notifications from one source, the Discord could well be it. Thank you all for being here. Cheers and ciao. I'm going to keep it under. Thank you, Eric Blair, Eric Keto, Dark Blade, moderator extraordinaire.